2021 is only a few days old and already we've got big news in Formula One. Unfortunately, it's about the calendar and specifically at this stage, the Australian Grand Prix. I'm Glenn Freeman and Scott Mitchell is here with me to discuss what's going on. So Scott, bring us up to speed. The Australian Grand Prix was cancelled last year. What's happening to the 2021 race?
Yeah, so as we sit here now, it's not officially 100% cancelled, but it's looking extremely unlikely, if not impossible, that the Australian Grand Prix can happen in March. So all signs point to the 2021 season opener being postponed. Melbourne, basically, the quarantine requirements have just become impossible, basically. F1 was hoping to put together an Abu Dhabi style biosphere to get around the need for a 2-week quarantine period in the country. That worked in Abu Dhabi. The season finale went ahead without a hitch. Basically, all personnel had to fly in on charter flights and then stay in hotels, and were only allowed to leave the hotels to get to the track. There was special transport put on, and basically F1 was working towards a similar idea in Australia. But unfortunately, as time has passed, obviously we know we're still in the grips of this pandemic. And what has happened is that Australia or the Victorian government have insisted that the biosphere is not sufficient. It has to be a quarantine to ensure maximum safety. It's the same thing that's happening with the Australian Open tennis tournament. So basically what that means is that Formula One would need to have 2 weeks of quarantine in Melbourne before even being allowed out to get stuck into the actual prep around setting up a Grand Prix and holding it, which means being in Melbourne for maybe three and a half weeks to kick off the season. And obviously, logistically, that's just a no-go, especially as that would mean flying out to Australia about a week before pre-season testing is currently scheduled to be held in Spain.
So the big question there is, if the season's not going to start where it was supposed to in Australia, what's the plan for how F1 gets this year going instead? Do we just move on to what was scheduled to be round 2?
Well, obviously, we'll get into sort of like the wider ramifications of what this means shortly. But for the here and now, what F1 I think is quite keen to communicate is that this doesn't mean suddenly the season gets plunged into crisis. So it's just Australia can't happen. So we move on to Bahrain. That becomes the season opener by default. It was meant to be holding its race 1 week after the Australian Grand Prix. My mental calendar is pretty weak. I'm sure that we can put a fancy graphic sort of here or something. But I think it's on the March the 28th. So basically what happens now is just business as usual. We wait for official confirmation that it can't happen at the start in Australia as planned. But as it stands, pre-season testing takes place at the start of March. Probably moves to Bahrain, I would imagine, to fit in with the new location for the season opener. So I don't foresee any races sort of coming in all of a sudden to take Australia's place. I don't think Bahrain's going to move its date. I think we just put back the start of the season by 7 days.
And you mentioned there the rest of the calendar. Now, 2020 will forever be remembered as the most disrupted season. We ended up at tracks we never thought we'd race at, tracks we never had raced at before. F1 was incredibly bullish when it first announced this 23-race calendar for 2021. From what you've heard so far, is every indication that the other 22 races should go ahead as planned at the moment?
Yeah, so this is kind of what I was alluding to before when I said that F1 probably doesn't want this to be seen as being plunged into chaos. So as I understand it, this is an Australia-specific problem. Now, that's not to say that F1's underestimating the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic or the fact that we're still having massive problems in countries all over the world, not just Australia as an isolated case. But as shown last year, F1 is capable of putting on a massive run of events during this pandemic. It just depends on what each of the individual countries wants to do. And as I understand it, F1's pretty confident that the restrictions required in other countries would still facilitate the Grand Prix. So it's the nature of the problem or the way that Australia is dealing with the problem that makes Melbourne a bit of a special case. So at the moment, I don't really see that F1 sort of considering this is, crisis mode, panic mode. I've always felt that a 23-race season would be optimistic in the circumstances. But I would be optimistic that just because Australia's going to be postponed, that's not necessarily the first of the many dominoes to fall, let's put it that way. And I think the best example of that is that in all of this, we're not saying that the Australian Grand Prix is cancelled completely in 2021 like it ultimately was in 2020. The hope is that it can be rescheduled for later in the year. It would be towards the end of the year, I'd imagine, somewhere in that flyaway run of Asian, American, and Middle Eastern races. I don't think we're going to go back to the days of Australia hosting the season finale. I don't think Adelaide's going to get a call up, but I would imagine that something sort of sensible can be reached, because last year Australia really didn't want to cancel, but it had to be because of the nature of it. It was all very short term. We've got a little bit more time here to work out a solution. So I would hope that Australia remains in the calendar in some capacity, as will the majority of the races that F1's got planned.
So that's where things stand now as we record this. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel to keep up with everything that's going to happen in F1 2021. We'll be covering as much as we can here on YouTube. But also check out our website, therace.com, for all the developments with the calendar and anything else going on in the world of F1. As this story moves on in small little steps, we'll be covering all of them on the website, I can assure you. And we'll see you again very soon for another video that hopefully brings a bit more good news.